had expected to arrive at my attorney's office earlier, but when my attorney arrived late and we subsequently entered the conference room, I found Mike and his female attorney already present, and witnessing their interaction stirred that familiar feeling of jealousy within me, a reaction that always surfaces whenever I see him in the company of an attractive woman. He was even more dashing now than he had been in his youth, tall and fit, with a thriving business of his own and a leadership position in the local chamber of commerce. I felt myself blush as Mike's elegant, fiery red-haired attorney gently took hold of his left forearm just above the wrist, a gesture of assurance of her support for him that, while slightly out of place in that kind of professional setting, wasn't entirely inappropriate from an official standpoint. It was a show of client support and reassurance, but I couldn't help interpreting it as a desire to end their professional relationship and to explore a personal one. As he turned to his attorney, Mike's face broke into his characteristic warm smile, but his expression quickly faded to neutrality before he turned back to me. However, this was not the scenario I had envisioned, and Mike's steadfast refusal to engage with me was so frustrating that I found myself having to arrange this meeting through my attorney. I sat in the chair across from the microphone while my attorney spoke with the red-headed lawyer. Mike proceeded to open his laptop, hook up a pair of small speakers, place a piece of paper and a pen next to it, and then disconcertingly placed his hands on the table with an unusually vacant expression, devoid of anger, hatred, sadness, or any visible emotion. When the attorney stopped talking, the female attorney began to preside, and we all know the purpose of our gathering. Ms. Jenny Henderson, the defendant, has agreed to sign the petition for divorce on the condition that my client, Michael Henderson, does as I say. If everyone is ready, I suggest we start the clock now. She placed a small kitchen timer on the table and the loud ticking sound broke the silence in the room. My goal was to force Mike to admit his own faults, even if only partially to justify my own behavior, and the prospect of revealing these private matters in front of strangers only heightened my unease. But there was no point in dwelling on the negativity, and I had no choice but to continue. After cheating, their self-esteem was hurt, and she suggested that I address that first and foremost. I cleared my throat and prepared to begin my opening statement. Thank you for meeting with me today, Mike. I want to begin by admitting that my behavior was wrong and that what happened was not your fault, but entirely my own selfishness and lack of consideration. From the beginning, as I reflected on my actions, I understood how deeply wrong I was, but I also recognized that our dynamic may have played a role, albeit indirectly. I know this will likely resonate with you, but I want to approach this conversation with transparency and honesty. I saw your reaction and I realized you were taking careful note of my words. Your expression remained neutral and you didn't even look directly at me. It almost knocked me completely off my feet that my initial words reflected exactly what he expected. It shook my confidence in my own arrogance. I ignored the fact that my argument was not only based on the fact that I had known him for 30 years, but that he had spent those same 30 years observing me, and I will admit that I was so enraged that I followed the script I had prepared to the letter, and well, as I mentioned, Mike, it was all my fault, the result of some stupid self-centered choices. When I got involved in church committees, I met Jasper, a true master of persuasion who knew how to manipulate me, and when he initially came across as a supportive friend, he listened to my troubles after church meetings, especially when you were absent so often last year. He portrayed himself as a thoughtful and confident man, and I didn't realize that he was adept at dismantling women's defenses from cafes to restaurants where he bemoaned the fact that his wife didn't understand him. I know it's a cliché, but by then I'd developed a trust in him, and the restaurants were getting more and more upscale, and the gifts he'd given me were getting more and more lavish, and oh Mike, you can't imagine that a man 15 years younger than me would try and cork how flattering it must have been if it had been over 4 months ago and he had asked me to marry him and I'd said no. You'd have been proud. I realized that once his intentions became clear, I should have cut ties with him then. At this juncture, I paused my sniffing and wiped my eyes with a finger that had inadvertently brushed against the onion slice in my pocket. I paused, then resumed, stumbling over my words as I hesitated. Oh, dear, I'm ashamed of myself for not ending my relationship with him sooner, when he took me to a fancy restaurant and spent $300 on a bottle of Granger, even though he doesn't drink. I'm almost certain this was his plan all along. When we left the restaurant, he offered to drive me home, and I stupidly agreed. I was too intoxicated to push him away. and you know what I become after a drink or two, and then he started touching me, and you know at that point my sanity was completely warped and all I could think about was getting him out of the driveway before the neighbors found us, which is why I suggested he park in the garage. I want to assure you that no one else was going to find out about this, except of course the two lawyers, and as the garage door closed Jasper stepped out of the car and proceeded to kiss me, and as I said I was already most of the way through a bottle of GRA and was powerless to resist. I was drunk, and he had been courting me for 4 or 5 months, and must have been exhausted, and I want you to know that I wouldn't have agreed to it if I hadn't been so under the influence, and I would have been horrified when I woke up and I would have opened the door for him at once, and then you walked in, and when you turned on the light and came into the room, I turned and looked at my husband with pleading eyes, and after a lifetime of familiarity, I was sure that I could read his expression like an open book, and gauge the success of my entreaties. My voice, "Don't you kiss me, your breath smells like beer." The recording said, followed by Jasper's voice, "Why is your breath so good? I've only had 1 glass of white wine." Yes, I felt embarrassed and humiliated when Mike found me with Jasper that night, and before that he had taken swift revenge on Jasper for his exhibitionism, but those feelings paled in comparison to the shame of being caught in such a huge lie. I felt a pang of embarrassment as I caught a glimpse of my own expression. Meanwhile Mike stared at me, his face devoid of expression but full of anticipation, and afterwards I couldn't figure out why I hadn't grasped the significance of the situation. Why did he have a tape recorder, unless he expected to record something incriminating what else was on the tape? These thoughts left me momentarily helpless, overshadowed by the humiliation of being caught effortlessly and emotionlessly. Holding onto it as desperately as a drowning man catches the breeze in the ocean. It only happened once, it won't happen again, I swear. Please believe me, I don't have the strength to resist him, but I'm not so out of control that I won't insist on defending myself, or letting him take advantage of us in our bed. He wants to, you know, but I can't do it. No matter how enthralled I am. He shakes his head and turns to his computer, and I feel him clicking on an icon instead of an H. I was startled until Jasper's voice echoed through the room. As the recording ends, another double click breaks the silence and Jasper's voice echoes through the air once more. When will we be able to recreate the thrill of your clueless husband's bed? The notion that there was no betrayal of my husband in our own bed all turned into a lie in a few sentences of self-condemnation. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Tick-tock, I couldn't speak despite my embarrassment. I tried to suppress my inner panic. I'm sorry I lied to you, Mike, and by saying it was the first time, I mean, I just couldn't bear to hurt you anymore. I thought if I could convince you that it was just a one-time thing and that the reason I gave would ease your pain, the silence that followed my words, that I should now admit to seeing Jasper a couple times a week. I was kept in the dark, but I knew that one more lie would destroy me, so I had to be careful, stick to ambiguity, and stick to the truth. The truth was that Jasper had successfully wooed me, though not right away. There was an undeniable feeling of validation when someone my age was being courted by a man my age. I have considered making up lies about how I only used the master bed once on the initial occasion, which would have been more favorable to me, even though it would have been untrue. I can't remain silent about all the problems that have plagued us. Time is running out and I desperately need to rectify this disastrous situation. I want you to know, Mike, that my love and respect for you has never wavered, and that my feelings for Jasper are just one more aspect of my life that in no way diminishes my feelings for you. I realized that he was frowning out of confusion, not any reaction to my words. I listened again to Jasper's question about couples sharing a bed, and once again I was shocked at my answer, and I was ashamed of my words. Yeah, but he's such a no-brainer. I thought he was adorable when we first started. He was so trusting, even when the signs were very obvious. I can't even convince myself that I still harbor love and respect for my husband, let alone convey it to him. Before this conversation, I had convinced myself that my love and respect for Mike was eternal. Tick-tock, tick-tock, in the heavy, oppressive silence that followed the latest blow to my outlook, Mike turned his gaze to me, and, unable to meet his eyes, I turned to his attorney, whose disdain was so evident on her face that I flinched involuntarily. I tore my eyes away from her, only to find my own attorney equally dismissive of me, and I wasn't quick enough to hide my disdain. I was locked in a battle for my future, surrounded by people who thought I was nothing more than an inconvenience. When one of them was supposed to be defending me, my confidence dissipated like a mist in the noonday sun, and right on its heels was my sense of self-worth, and I was left with the feeling that I'd never been a better person for it. Maybe that's why I find myself going back to my notes and whispering in order to take a firmer stand. There's no denying, Mike, that over the past 6 months or so, you've been paying less and less attention to me, you've been taking me for granted, traveling more frequently, and I'd venture to say that you've been growing more and more emotionally distant from me. It's all coincided with the departure of our child, leaving me feeling adrift. You weren't there when I needed you most, you didn't reassure me when I was at my lowest point in my emotional state. I couldn't help but cringe as his fingers flew across the screen. The file he had opened contained a recording of Jasper's voice recording a moment not long after our uncomfortable encounter, just before Mike had taken us out. Before "I'm sorry, honey, it's been almost 2 weeks since we've been together. And you know I like to be on edge. No, seriously, 2 weeks is too long. Can't we make time to see each other more often? Stop complaining, it's been 2 weeks and I have needs, especially since you made me limit Mike's attention. He had a trip planned last week but cancelled it at the last minute. We could have gone somewhere else and you're only getting the attention tonight because Mike had an emergency meeting to attend. Believe me, I want more," Jasper insisted, sounding petulant. "You'll get whatever I decide to give you." Once again the replay stops and I feel ashamed, casting my eyes downward to avoid the inevitable accusations. Even someone as young and vivacious as Jasper was beginning to fade, and Jasper's betrayal of my husband was eroding my respect for Mike, and the most important thing about that was my conscience. As I prepared for this meeting with the intention of confronting him about his supposed emotional withdrawal, I realized that it was just a facade on his part to justify my continued betrayal of him. Because Mike's tenderness was so different from Jasper's impatience that there was no room for confusion, it was a clear reminder to me that my behavior was fundamentally wrong, and so I began to reject my husband's advances. A few months ago, Mike abruptly stopped our sexual relationship, and at the same time, he began working longer hours and traveling more frequently, which, at first, I saw as a way for him to emotionally distance himself from me. That's why he had the foresight to hide a tape recorder in Kelly's room. I would do anything to get back the life and future I longed for, and I thought I was dealing with a freshly enraged bull who was trying to calm his anger. If my suspicions were correct, and he knew about my cheating at least 2 weeks ago, then he was much more cunning than I thought. However, time slipped by in a relentless ticking clock, and I clutched at the note in desperation, searching for a glimmer of hope. It dawned on me that the note was now an obstacle because the dynamics of the situation had changed dramatically. Was I dissatisfied with the intimacy he offered? Did I find him boring and long for something more adventurous? Did I have feelings for Jasper? Was I plotting to leave him? If only I could recall the details of my conversation with Jasper on that fateful night, if only I could be sure that it was the only night Mike had a recording, if only I could be sure that it was the only night Mike had a recording, then surely this sequence of conversations must have been a confrontation in the suspicion of setting up a recorder. He couldn't have been sure for very long. And as an actor he simply wasn't skilled enough, and yet, when we both heard me denigrate him in front of my lover, how can I convince him of my respect for him? Even the strongest persuasion will not convince me of his love for me if I am unfaithful to him, so it is a gradual process to convince him of my love and respect for him. But how many more seconds can that relentless timer show before he makes his final decision? I know it seems that I have lost my love and respect for you, but I want to assure you that this is not the case and that my love for you and our life together remains unwavering. The shame I felt when you found out about my betrayal is a constant reminder to me to hold fast to our relationship for the rest of our days. I don't understand why I felt this way, especially after convincing myself that I was only making up for what I perceived to be your inadequacies, that my behavior was driven purely by lust and selfishness, and egotistical escapism, yes, indulging in physical pleasure until exhaustion, momentarily gratified but without any emotional connection. My voice trailed off as Mike's gaze stayed fixed on me, his finger finally pressing the expected button, and the room filled with my voice once again, my voice amplified beyond recognition on the recording. They say time expands in moments of danger, and marriages break up like this, as if the world around me were moving in slow motion while I stayed in real time. Meanwhile, Mike's lawyer changed positions to get a better view of the laptop screen. It dawned on me that the file Mike was playing was not a recording as I had initially suspected, but a video clip. Mike's reaction was heavier than any deliberate attack. Although his eyes were not on me, but on the screen in front of him. I couldn't tell if it was torture or a form of theft, because his eyes were glued to the scene unfolding on the screen, and in less and less time, his expression changed. The timestamp on the recording showed that this was a conversation that had taken place at least 3 weeks prior to our confrontation, suggesting that Mike had been silently observing my betrayal for some time, long enough to discern my attorney's tannin patterns. When my attorney handed me the divorce papers, I found myself unable to defend or excuse my tannin evidence against my husband, my beloved Mike, who effortlessly exposed my guilt. Mike played the role of conductor, conducting every movement without a word, utilizing the talents and skills of those around him, yet it wasn't Mike who executed me. It was I who voluntarily boarded when he effortlessly activated the last clip. My realization hit me like a freight train. He didn't hesitate for a moment. He didn't even look at me. He knew my every move. He knew my every move, my every word, as if he had unfettered access to my inner world. I had carefully constructed my argument based on decades of intimate observation, forgetting that he had watched me for just as long with those sharp, discerning eyes. Shame and humiliation suffocated me, igniting a primal urge to flee. I longed to escape back to the familiar house where remnants of my life remained, at least until Mike enforced the eviction order. However, the path to freedom came at a heavy price. I had to give up most of my life's possessions. With trembling hands, I signed both agreements. My attorney quickly gathered the signed documents, handed one of them to the woman who had become the painful symbol of betrayal, then placed the rest in his briefcase and left the room. I remained seated, gripped by a paradoxical paralysis, torn between the urge to flee and the desire to leave with a glimmer of hope, a glimmer of optimism that I hoped to cultivate into something more substantial, a reminder to myself that, in the midst of this mess, I still harbored an inkling of concern for Mike's well-being, when a sudden blaring of an alarm shattered my serenity and spurred me to resolve to act. I stood up, determined to leave a parting message with a positive message, even if the woman who now clutched Mike's arm with both hands radiated a sense of predatory satisfaction. "I'll never forgive myself if your life gets this dark." In response, Mike played another clip of Denim, thankfully not in my voice, but in the shrill tones of another woman. "What has that wretched boy done?" If Jasper was facing divorce and poverty as a consequence of his infidelity, it seemed an appropriate punishment, but the prospect of him being put to death for his relationship with me added another burden to my already burdened conscience. He had lost almost everything I held dear, and in addition to the house and the money, he had suffered a profound emotional blow. As I reached the door, I reluctantly said goodbye to my dear. My feeble attempts to salvage the vestiges of our past life were swiftly dispatched like an insignificant pest, and perhaps my daughter Laura would come to see me while I drowned my sorrows in oblivion. Instead, another recording of Denim, a young male voice cries out with emotion, "What nerves did mommy do?" followed by a familiar female voice asking, "Are you sure? It looks like I'll be facing my demons alone tonight, with only the solace of a bottle for companionship." Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story. Please consider liking and subscribing if you enjoyed it, and if you haven't yet, feel free to share in the comments below your thoughts on the events.